the General Manager of the Infosys Science Foundation, and I'm very pleased to welcome you here along with my colleagues, Sireen Qasim, Roti Shashikumar, and Swati Revankar. So this is the 4th annual Infosys Prize Winners Symposium. We have had this symposium in the past as a platform to talk about where the winners showcase their work, how they work, and spark interdisciplinary conversations. Sorry. So this year, they're still going to talk about their work, and I will leave them to introduce themselves and their work to you. But without further ado, I would like to invite the very first speaker for the evening, Professor Arun Chandrasekhar, who's been selected by the jury for his work in social and economic networks. Arun, over to you. Oh, I forgot to mention, we'll have a 5-minute Q&A after the speaker speaks for around 12 to 13 minutes. So reserve your questions for the Q&A. And if you have further questions, please join us for tea outside. Over to you.
Thanks. Today I'm going to give a bird's eye view as to why I think the analysis of social networks should be used to thinking about economic policy design, particularly in developing economies. So developing economies are sort of characterized by lack of well-functioning formal institutions. What I mean by this is think about limited credit markets, poor access to insurance, limited information about helpful opportunities, weak contracting environments, poor health delivery services, and so on and so forth. And in this setting, what people do in lieu of the formality is to rely on each other. For example, kin, friends, and so on and so forth. Think about a chit fund, trade credit, job referrals, and so on and so forth. The question then becomes for us, when we're thinking about policy design, how do our decisions change when relationships replace institutions? And it turns out it's pretty substantial. I'm going to cover 3 domains in this talk, just to give you a sense of how expansive these insights potentially are. But the punchline I want you to take away is that the network's perspective often, not always, but certainly in these examples, yields opposite conclusions to those of convention. And this is not just some theoretical curiosity, but rather they're empirically borne out in a number of large randomized controlled trials we conducted both here in Karnataka and then in a couple of other states. So what do I mean by an informal economy? The way I like to think about an informal economy is that you have a collection of people, I'll call it agents. Think about these as individuals or firms or whatnot, and they will interact with each other, and there's heterogeneous value in these interactions. And the interactions could be strategic, so they could do it with some purpose. And so this is going to generate a shape to the social fabric, an outcome of choice and chance. And importantly, it's going to be laden with asymmetries. So some people are going to be very powerful, and some people are not going to be powerful at all. And the thing to take away is that conventional models that omit this kind of information can't omit it entirely, because by construction, every model that has different players in it has a geometry in the background, whether you know it or not. And so it doesn't really help to be unrealistic about it, is my point. So imagine there are 2 households, for example, and in case of, say, crop failure, one household helps the other out. But also imagine that when there's information to be had, a household passes the information to another. And then also imagine that they like to play cricket together. Right? So this is relationships between 2 households in a village, but they live embedded in a larger community, a village. And so this is what you call a multigraph. It's a larger mathematical object. That's a little complicated for this talk, so I'm going to simplify it to say that we're going to conceive of a network where players are going to be linked if there's some sort of relationship between them. It doesn't matter the nature of them. And we have 2 considerations I want you to keep in mind. The first is who wants to link with whom and for what purpose. And the second is what are the asymmetries that are generated, because this is going to matter for economic outcomes. So this is real data. This is a village from Kola, actually. And nodes here are households, and links are whether or not there's any form of transaction between the households. And in the experiments I'm going to talk about, I'm going to cover about 300,000 individuals. And every village has some structure like this. I'm going to tell you what to focus on in a second. For this talk, I want you to focus on two things. One might be surprising, but when you look at this, I want you to understand society is empty. You tend to think of societies as connected, but the very fact that you can see something, say there's 150 households here, the fact that there's even, I guess here, black space, means that basically links don't exist between households, right? That means the second thing, society is sensitive. That is, if I add a few links here or there between households, I can really change the outcome of the economics. And in some deep sense, there's therefore a fragility. And so calling attention to this sort of fragility is going to be a large part of how we think about actual policy design in the domains of like health, finance, and information. Okay. So the first one I want to focus on. The first one is pretty easy. It's a warm-up. It's about microfinance. Credit is pretty easy to understand. If you have an adverse shock, you borrow to help you deal with the shock. And maybe if you're an entrepreneur, you borrow in order to expand a business. So the conventional way we think about it is that a bank finds clients. They identify those who have demand. They don't give access to everybody. And this generates two buckets, the clients who benefit, and then the non-clients who didn't have credit before and don't have credit now. That's it, full stop, right? A network perspective nuances this a little bit, because if you're embedded in this network, when you have access to credit, it reduces your need to rely on others. Therefore, you shear those social relationships. At the same time, if you know anything about microfinance, you meet in these regular meetings. So you build some social capital amongst each other. And the net effect for clients is mildly positive. Basically, they're able to withstand shocks pretty well. They can start some businesses. But what about the non-clients? They actually know that there's less likely to be reciprocation out there for investing in social relationships. So what you actually find, and you see this in multiple experiments at scale, is that there's a huge loss in links ranging from 12 to 26% amongst non-clients to non-clients who had nothing to do with access to credit whatsoever. That should be shocking, but much even worse is the fact that if you think about income vulnerability, it more than doubles for these people. And yet they had nothing to do with credit. And so the punchline is normally we think about policy of providing credit in the context of a credit study. But what we really want to do is if we offer credit over here, we want to think about the insurance domino effect way over there for the uninvolved. All right. The second example is information dissemination. So during the 2016 demonetization, in a 7-week span, there were 54 rule changes. That's a lot of rule changes. And so a natural thing to do is to try to inform people to dispel potential rumors. So there's two natural strategies to do it, or at least one natural strategy. The first one is you want to broadcast information widely, right? You want to tell a lot of people what the changes are to make sure they're okay. The second thing you might do is you might just tell a few people, 5 in each village, and rely on virality. And so here we have an experiment covering 40,000 households in Orissa. And I'm going to introduce one thing, this vertical bar, where the bottom is you haven't heard the information at all, and the top is you have high comprehension of the rules. Just keep those colors in mind. So the conventional perspective is when you give information, it's somewhat clear. If it's somewhat clear, then if I told only 5 people, I colored in 2, then they speak to some people. The act of conversing clears up some doubts. You have a little bit of depth. And that's the resulting distribution of how much people know. Not a whole lot. But if you broadcast information to everybody, then everybody starts off pretty well. They like to talk about it. It really deepens the information. And the distribution of knowledge is quite high. That's convention. Of course, this is not at all what was happening. So if you go and do extensive surveys, which is what we did, you find first that over 80% of people report confusion when receiving widespread signals. This is not unique to the demonetization. In general, when we provide signals to people, we assume everybody gets everything. It's complicated. It's complicated. But the second thing, and much more importantly, is perception concerns. The vast majority of people felt that when they know that other people know they received information, if they go and ask for help, they're viewed as ignorant. And so they don't. So this really matters in a network diffusion process because the policy essentially deforms the network. We used to think that the initial information was clear, but it's not. And then when you broadcast information, if it's ignorant, if you ask a question, then you choose not to ask questions. So all those links drop. And so then if you have some diffusion, it doesn't really go anywhere, and there's not a lot of depth. But if you give information to only a few people, then people are encouraged to ask questions, then it diffuses more widely, and then there's more depth of information. You might think, whoa, this is like a mathematical parlor trick, but the point is this is a large randomized control trial. So no, actually it played out that way. When he told only 5 people, it more than tripled the number of conversations about the demonetization relative to broadcasting to 100% of the village. And much more importantly, it almost, or 2.5, it's hard to say, 3 times the correct decision rate in a high-stakes financial decision, more than a day's wage that depended on knowing the right rules. So bottom line was telling 5 people was way better than broadcasting to everybody. I'm not saying we shouldn't tell everybody information. I'm saying we should be attentive to these sort of endogenous communication frictions. It's super important. Okay, last one. So here, instead of a conventional perspective, let me put into relief this idea that, look, we like graph theory, we like networks, let's take it very seriously. So we have high quality data, we have great ML epi models, and we want to do strategic interventions, okay? This is actually an aspiration when COVID hit that our group tried to do a lot of. And so you want to target where the disease goes based on data, you can predict based on the model everywhere it'll go, you can use the model, you can identify a place to lock down, and then you can optimally target. Sounds really good. But remember fragility. Fragility is a major issue here. And so you can ask a question as to whether or not this is really a stable outcome you should expect, where if you use these models, can you stably predict where things go? And it turns out, let's just say we miss less than 0.05% links. This number I'm pulling from an example we ran with California policy, but this is actually a probability theory result. So it's like, let's imagine you miss a very tiny percentage of link. Then, when you try to estimate where the diffusion goes, the real diffusion will leak. But it'll leak just enough that you're going to miss a substantial amount of it. And so your optimal policy will all be chasing these leakages, and you kind of won't be able to get there. So if you were trying to use a lot of this tech, you're way too overconfident, precisely because of this fragility issue. What if you could perfectly forecast all future interactions anyway? So you had no measurement error in interactions. You knew every person is going to interact with every single person going forward, but all you were wrong about was patient 0. You were off by, say, 1%. You didn't know that this person was patient 0, you thought this one was patient 0. You can prove something like that, again, holds, that you'll be slightly off, and that'll snowball, and eventually you're going to actually be way off in terms of who you're locking down. So this, again, is not just a numerical example. It's like a structural property of this class of process. And so what it tells us isn't that we shouldn't use the technical detail. I love the technical detail. I work on it. But rather, we should use it in the form that's amenable to policy design. So here, we should leverage network structure in a way that's robust to its fragility, rather than have false confidence and pretend that it's not fragile. All right. So that leaves us with 3 things. So the first is there's a huge danger in ignoring networks. Every model assumes some structure, whether you wish it or not. And so this idea of writing down policy designs based on economic models that are inattentive to the social fabric is a bit goofy. At the same time, there's a sort of general disposition we get once we work in the space where we're very techy and we really know what we can do with everything. And that's a little bit dangerous as well because it's exactly the kinds of things that are unstable. And so what we need to do going forward, I think, is worry a lot about robust policy design. Thanks.
Thank you for explaining the policy implications of your work. And the panel that chose Professor Chandrasekhar was headed by Professor Kaushik Basu. We have time. We have 5 minutes for any questions that anyone has. Please raise your hand here. Can we have a mic here, please?
Hi, my question is the following. You say that you start from 5 guys and then trying to spread the news through them rather than broadcasting.
Yeah.
But you know that when the information goes from one person to another, and if you have a chain of transmission of information, there is loss of information, degradation, corruption, alteration, everything happens. So in your model of comparing, when it is broadcast, the information goes straight as it is to everyone, whereas this chaining and passing on could leave certain corruptions. So what are the aspects that you consider in your model to make the comparison meaningful? Because I see that there is something might miss in this chain?
No, that's almost certainly that happens first. So the comparison, in some sense, is not theoretical. It's an experiment. So the answer is what happened happened. And so when you deliver information to people directly, I think the thing you suggested was handing somebody information is devoid of corruption. I think the premise is wrong. Handing somebody information doesn't mean they correctly get it. It means they get an unclear signal of the world. And so you can interpret that however you want. It's not because it's through a game of whispers. It's because it's just hard to understand stuff. And so what you're really running a race between is I give you some information and you kind of understand it and you need clarification versus I give somebody information and it's spreading and maybe it's deformed, but maybe there's more encouragement of conversations. And all these effects are on at once, surely. And that's why you need to do an experiment, because what is better is essentially an empirical question. And the answer is one seems to dominate the other. Yeah.
Thanks for a really good talk. How dependent are your results on knowing the structure of the network? Or is it you just need to know that it's sparse or something like that? Or
which part? So the three, I have different answers for the three different papers. So.
All right, give me three different answers then.
Sorry. So the third one's the most technical. I'll come back to that later. But this broadcast versus not one, you don't. So what we use is actually. You don't need to know the graph at all. It's you could explain that with two people, essentially. It's essentially what do I do if I know you know that I have some information and need to make a request versus not? So the dynamic is very simple. You don't care about the graph, and you certainly don't need it for policy. What was my first example? Microfinance. Okay. Yeah. That doesn't care too much. Like the phenomenon that people drop links because they know that there'll be less reciprocation doesn't require a whole lot on the network's structure if it's itself. The third one relies on, depends on how in the weeds we want to go here, but it depends on the following. To think about targeting policy when things spread, it makes sense to think about what I'm going to call an intermediate term, because when you take the long run, it essentially saturates or it completely dies, and in the short run, nothing happens. And so when you look at that intermediate limit, what you want for that to have content is you don't care that the graph is sparse or dense per se. You want the expansion of whatever you're studying to be polynomial and live in that time period. So it has to kind of have emerged, but it's not fully exploded. But that's exactly the moment where you want to do policy, right? Because you want to target before it completely explodes. And so in that interval, the result essentially is that if you take a percolation system with polynomial expansion, and then what you do is you perturb it slightly, then that small error will overwhelm that rate.
What would be your advice to the Karnataka government when they come out with a new policy next year?
Policy concerning?
Well, based on your work, how would you like Karnataka to disseminate a policy?
Oh, in terms of okay, yeah,
Absolutely.
So I think a big thing that we need to do is we need to generate encouragement designs to participate in comprehension. So I think we shouldn't do is. So in a lot of sub-Saharan Africa, when they do agricultural extension, they do a lot of that here too. They have farmers get together and they try to have them figure it out on their own. That's how we try to introduce schemes in a lot of places. That's dangerous because that lets these perception issues come up. If we all meet together and we try to understand a policy, we end up being unwilling to talk and we don't learn. But you need designs that essentially break the perception and so make it so that there's no signaling going on. And so when you introduce a new policy, you want to make it so that people understand people don't comprehend things. Make that very clear. That seems very simple, but it's the same problem I face in classrooms when students don't raise hands when they have questions. Because you want to set an equilibrium where people are willing to ask questions and understand commonly that there's room to actually comprehend the schemes. Because if they don't understand the schemes, they don't avail the benefits.
Arun, I want to take you over from Mr. Murthy's very practical question to the other end.
Okay.
I'm very curious when I know that you know, or I know that you know that I know, that, as you know in economics, there are these results where if it's infinite, Rubinstein's famous paper, totally different from even if it's 100 times I know that you know. I'm very curious in these networks, which I don't do at all. Does it make a difference if it is a couple of times or if it is an infinite times that I know that you know that I know that you know?
Yeah, so there's so like you're talking about P common knowledge basically, right? Okay. Yeah, so the quick answer for efficiency, then we can talk more offline, is yes and no. Yes, it makes a difference, but this phenomenon would operate both for P common knowledge and complete common knowledge. And the way we model it, because P common knowledge is annoying, is common knowledge. So common knowledge with knowledge that some event may not happen. Like it's rare to be in a situation where things are broadcast, but it's not common knowledge. So that's like a sleight of hand to deliver that mechanism. But yeah.
Hi, I have a question about trust. So I wonder how fairly sparse models like yours take into account things like not only socioeconomic status, but also in the Indian context, things like, say, caste, but also the level of trust that people place in the source of information. And I need not remind you that in the United States, 50% of people feel that the legacy media lies to them. So who should they trust? And how should that play out in the dissemination of information?
Yeah, so I think that this is related in some sense to like my response to Mr. Murthy as well, which is so this is a good example. One thing that happens here, and we've seen a lot in the data, is when you go to tell somebody here's a new scheme, right? And the scheme, if you like do this training, this job will pay you X, and you ask them, do you want this? They say, oh no, that seems too good to be true. They don't believe it. There's a skepticism about the benefit that exists to avail, right? And this happens also when you have interpersonal relationships and people like say things to each other. There's a bit of, I will believe information only from a sparse set of people. And so what you do is you take a network model of learning and you have like government agents that broadcast information and you allow people to believe whether or not the state of the world is true or false. And so this is a model of skepticism and learning in networks. It's complicated. It's a thing we're actually actively working on and have been working on for a while. And the answer to how to address this is, in some sense, boring but important, which is like you have to recognize it's the case, much like dispelling these signaling attitudes. You have to then like provide information that ex ante is likely to be believed even by skeptical people. And so then when they partake, they update that it's likely trustworthy, and then you iterate on this, and you can get rational people to converge to learning that it's useful. But it requires adding that to the model and thinking it through.
Thank you. I know we all have a lot more questions for you, Arun. And for those of us who do, let's catch him over chai. Thank you.
Thank you.
Our next speaker is the winner of the Infosys Prize in Engineering and Computer Science, Professor Shyam Golakota, who was chosen by a jury headed by Professor Jayati Murthy. And he's being recognized for his impactful research in areas like battery-free computing, mobile health, and AI-augmented auditory sensing. I'm going to leave him to tell you more.
All right, so today I'm going to be talking about some of the work we have been doing on creating superhuman hearing. So if you think about hearing and auditory perception, they've been around for a while. In fact, they've been around for more than 300 million years ago. They first showed up in aquatic animals like fish. And as life migrated to be on land, the tympanic membrane, which is essential to hear on land, apparently evolved in 5 different instances independently, which kind of shows you the importance of hearing and auditory perception for life and evolution of life on this planet. Despite this, one may argue that humans have a pretty limited spatial and semantic auditory perception. So what do these terms really mean here? So to understand this, let's actually look at your visual perception. So if you look at this image you see over here, there's so much information you can gain from it. You know how many objects are in this picture. You know what they're doing. You know that the person is waiting at the intersection to cross. You can also figure out what the relative 2D locations of the different objects are. So there's so much information from just one image that you could actually capture. It turns out that getting this kind of an intelligence is way more challenging by just using your auditory perception. So I'm going to play you a recording from a mixture of audio.
So people from all sorts of different directions.
So if I asked you how many people were there in this mixture, any guesses? It's actually 5, but you have no way of verifying. I could as well say it is 4, and it might be 4. And the reason for this is that it's really hard to figure out how many people are speaking in that mixture, let alone who is saying what and who is speaking to whom, or even the 2D locations of the different speakers in this room. So these tasks, which were pretty straightforward for the visual perception, are way more challenging for the human brain when it comes to audio. So the question which we have been exploring for the last few years is, can we create AI hearables that can augment the auditory perception of humans? So imagine you are sitting in the park, and you want to relax and you want to enjoy the relaxing sounds of the birds. But as luck would have it, you have a bunch of people who come, sit next to you, and wouldn't stop talking. Now, let's say you have a headset or an AirPod that could give you the ability to listen to just the sounds of the birds, while the rest of the sound just goes away. Or you're vacuuming around the house, and your headphone can suppress the piercing sounds of the birds, of the vacuum cleaner, but it'll allow still useful information like someone knocking on the door. If you look at today's headsets, they either suppress everything or they let everything in. But to achieve the vision I just outlined over there, you need high-level intelligence to understand and identify different sounds in the environment. You need to be able to separate the target sound from the interfering sounds and noise, and you should also preserve the direction of the sound so you know where it's coming from. And if all this is not hard enough, you got to do all these things with just a few milliseconds of audio on a resource-constrained platform like a phone or a headset. And that's exactly what we demonstrated in a system we call semantic hearing. So let me show you a video demo of the system.
Allow only door knocks.
So this was all running in real time on the headset itself. Just to give you a high-level idea of how it works, you are wearing headsets, you want to listen to the sounds of the birds in the presence of people speaking. The first thing you're going to do is you're going to turn on the noise cancelling on the headset, which is going to remove all the sounds in the environment and give you a clean slate to play with. Now what you're going to do is you're going to take the data from the left and the right microphone, send it to a processing unit like a smartphone in this case, and run a real-time neural network that in real time extracts out the target sound you care about. And within a few milliseconds, we're going to play it back into the ear and make it look like you're only listening to the sounds of the birds while suppressing everything else. Very challenging. It's very easy to show this picture. It was very challenging to build this system for the first time. But this is kind of important to understand and understand the implications of this, which is that you can now, for the first time, program your acoustic scenes in real time. And this can open up opportunities to create the future of intelligent hearables like AirPods, headsets, hearing aids that can augment the human auditory perception. So what else can we do to augment this perception? To this, we actually looked at the human brain for inspiration. If you think about the human brain, it can focus on speech from a target speaker. So if you knew how I sounded like, for example, you know what my accent is, how I pronounce things. Even if you, for the next if I go to a noisy environment, it's easier for you to follow me. So given prior knowledge of how I sound like, the human brain can try to understand you better of how you actually sound like. So the question we asked is, can we create intelligent hearables that can achieve this thing which we are calling target speech hearing, which is the ability to ignore all the speakers and noise in the environment except for the target speaker. Let me show you a video demo which kind of gets the point across of how we are actually achieving this.
Hey Malik, you're wearing a target speech hearing system. Let's say you're in an environment where there's not only ambient noise, but also background speech that you want to discuss. So you can just press a button on the right of the headphone set while I'm speaking. What this does is this will record a speech sample of my voice and extract my voice. From that point on, you'll only be able to hear my voice while suppressing any other sound, including speech, in the environment. You're wearing the target speech hearing system. You can click the button on the right and then look at me for a few seconds. Now when you're looking at me, the system would register my voice and enroll it. Now you can take a walk. So now the system has an enrollment of my voice. It can focus on only my voice while ignoring all the interfering sound in the...
So this is a completely real-time AI which is running and processing continuously and making this whole thing happen on these headsets in all these practical environments like outdoor and indoor environments. But you might actually argue, say that what I showed you is imitating the human brain, not really giving you superpowers, right? So the next question we asked is, oh, the slide was misplaced, but can we actually create a sound bubble around me? For example, I'm sitting on the table. I only want to listen to people around the table and not anyone outside the table. So can I create this kind of a sound bubble by just using hearables? It turns out that this is actually a very hard problem for humans because humans can figure out which direction the sound is coming from. But if you just ask them to figure out what's the distance of the person, if you close their eyes, it's really hard to do. In fact, people have shown that this distance perception becomes even more challenging with unfamiliar speakers in unknown environments. But to create something like a sound bubble, you got to identify and separate the different speakers within the bubble from those which are outside the bubble. And this should work even if the speakers outside are much louder. And it should have an end-to-end latency of less than 20 milliseconds. It should run on something as constrained as a Raspberry Pi. And you should be able to program this distance of your bubble. Maybe you want a 1 meter bubble, or 2 meter bubble, or 3 meter bubble. And more importantly, they should generalize to real world, unseen users, and river brain rooms. A lot of things which we have to be solved to basically show that this can actually happen. And it's also interesting because AI is typically trying to imitate humans, and this is a task where humans are actually not good at it. So can we even do this? We show that indeed we can do this stuff. So there's a lot of math involved in getting this, but I'm going to show you the demo of the system.
Hey, what did you do last week?
Hey, Jeremy, how you doing? I go to an amazing ice cream shop.
I made you like illustrations for us?
Not a fan of ice cream. I'm okay to have it, but I'm more of I like hot desserts, more like brownie or something.
So we're going to brownie sounds good. Thai food. Yeah, I could really have
some. It's too sweet for me.
Oh,
yeah, it's just my taste not that good.
Hey, what did you do last week?
I go to an amazing ice cream shops. Yeah.
You like ice cream?
Not a fan of ice cream. I'm okay to have it, but I'm more of I like hot desserts, more like brownie or something.
Brownie sounds good. Yeah, I could really have some.
It's too sweet for me.
Oh.
Yeah, my taste not that good.
Clearly a very important point of discussion over there. But you might see something very interesting over there, which is that we had multiple people within the bubble. They were also speaking on top of each other. And it was still able to extract them out and remove people who are outside the bubble in the first place. So we also integrated this with actual headsets. It's kind of cool because it kind of looks like it's a virtual wall. So he's talking, you can't hear anything, but as he comes into the bubble, you'll suddenly start to hear what he's saying.
Now you can hear my voice very clearly.
So if you're in Seattle at any point of time, you can come and experience these demos. It literally feels like a virtual wall. And all you're doing here is a headset and a lot of AI which is running in real time to basically achieve this kind of a capability. So what I kind of showed you is the 3 systems which we've built over the last few years on augmenting the human auditory perception using AI. And this is kind of exciting for me because we're effectively defining the future of billions of earphones, headsets, as well as hearing aids, which can impact billions of people across the planet. But if you take a step back, in contrast to the large models which all the big tech firms are competing with each other to basically outbeat each other, there's a lot of exciting work to do in resource-constrained environments, like something which is really, really tiny, like your headphone, and so on and so forth, in terms of creating the right interface between AI and humans. And this requires not just working on AI, but also requires working on things like real-time on-device neural networks, embedded hardware, understanding the constraints of the hardware itself, and more importantly, understanding and defining the right application that will not only kind of blur the line between science fiction and reality, but can also have an impact on billions of people out there. So thank you so much, and happy to take any questions.
Thank you. That was. Sorry?
Hello. Yeah.
I'm curious about the relations between the abilities that you are mapping or modeling at the low level, neural network level, or even slightly higher symbolic architecture. But when somebody hears something as a knock, right? They presumably have to have some other concepts like a door and the door being closed and so on. So that is presumably happens at the personal level and not the subpersonal level. Or for instance, if I hear not just a knock, but I hear impatience, I literally hear impatience in what I hear. That all that comes from semantic abilities at the personal level. So I'm just curious about what is the relationship between the deliverances of the systems and the neural networks at the subpersonal level and these higher personal level inputs, the as it were, distal inputs.
I think the way to think about, at least in that particular context, is that you have lots of data. For example, this is a door knock, and you have hundreds and thousands of examples for what door knocks look like. You have thousands of examples for what bird chirping looks like. So effectively what we are doing is we give this text label for each of these classes of sounds you want to basically support in your headset itself, and training the network with all these different classes itself. But you don't really need to do this in the new techniques which are being used in neural networks. You don't really need labeled data, because as long as you give it enough data, it will learn itself enough data with some labels, without some labels, because if you have some labels which says this has a door knock plus like maybe a vacuum cleaner noise, you figure it out. But if you have enough data with all these combinations and you train the neural network itself, it's going to be able to map the relationship between the audio characteristics and the specific text level semantic label itself. And that's the cool thing about having enough data and the architecture itself, that they can figure it out automatically.
That's going to take so much data. Anyone else have a question, especially from the back of the room?
We are, so we have been working, as soon as we put this out, clearly we have had lots of interest from almost all the major augmented reality as well as hearing aid companies as well as hearables, and I'm planning to do a startup on this particular topic as well. But I do think that you should be able to see at least a subset of these capabilities in the next 3 to 5 years. I would be really surprised if your AirPods or like your hearing aids don't really support this. It would be a shame, honestly.
Yeah. Hi, loved your work today. So my question is about the bubbles that you mentioned, right? So how are you guys determining what the bubble size is? Because as far as I know, you did not mention anything about the spatial dimension necessarily to measure the spatial dimension. So I could be quite far away and be loud, and it could be registered as something that is close by because the voice itself is loud. So how are you guys determining that bubble? How are you guys measuring how fast?
When we started this project, that's the reason why people were like, when we started out, it was unclear if we can even do this because of the exact same reason you mentioned. You can't use amplitude information to figure out where you are in particular in terms of the space. So the prototype you showed there is using microphones, multiple microphones, which gives you some spatial information, but it's not enough. So one of the few things which you're leveraging is that when you have a face, all of us have faces, and when you get acoustic signals, these signals reflect off the human face itself. And what you're getting are a bunch of these reflections at each of these microphones. And what the AI is trying to learn is how these reflections of your face, with respect to each of the sound, relates to the distance to that particular sound itself. So when we have enough data, we collected lots of robotic data with different facial structures and different rooms. That's what's allowing the model to get that relationship between the shape of your face and the actual distance to the wearer itself. So we don't really use amplitude information. We use this kind of what is called head-related transfer function, or HRTF, of your face itself to be able to extract this information.
I actually had a question about how you guys are detecting the faces as well in the demo that you showed.
Can we do this as a follow-up question? I think there's one question at the back there. If you can just hand the microphone there.
If you have only single voice source, but the source is very low amplitude and maybe reflections and that kind of thing, is it possible to get that compared to conventional amplification?
We can. We actually showed up till minus 15 dB, where it's below the noise by minus 15 dB, which means that the noise is greater than the source. There is, of course, like ethical issues, which is, let's say you're having a conversation that's pretty far away, and I look at you and suddenly I start picking you up. So to avoid that, we limited it to minus 15 dB. We didn't explore beyond that because we didn't want to get into those ethical considerations.
Got it. But maybe governments may be interested. Thank you.
As a question, your demo showed sort of the whole soundscape. The output was 0 except for something. Is it just as easy to output the whole soundscape except for something? Like, you literally don't hear the door knock.
Yes. In fact, like one of the things people keep suggesting is I want to ignore one particular person. But for obvious reasons, we didn't demo it. But in terms of the model output itself, it basically is equally efficient at doing that.
So you alluded to the fact that humans are very good at what is called the cocktail party effect. If there are a lot of people talking, a person can still sort of understand lower amplitude speech embedded in much higher amplitude noise, because not only are they focused on the person's voice, as you alluded to, but very importantly, I think this is the point that Akhil was trying to make, you have some sense of the content or the meaning of what the person is saying.
Yep.
So while you have done impressive work, what are the prospects of getting semantics out of speech or sounds into your headphone?
It really depends on what level of semantics you need. If you want like sentence level semantics, you need really large models. But if you want like words, because the word itself, if I start with meat, that's closer to meat, and it's not closer to like something else which starts with an M. So that can really help improve the performance of achieving these kind of skills. So word level semantics are actually much easier on something which is like a headphone. But if you're talking about a sentence level semantics, that requires figuring out the relationship between one word to the other word, the verb, the noun, all those relationships which are much harder to encode in a small network. And those kind of, you need at least like 1 billion parameters, which is something which you need a phone to run on. It's really hard to run that on current headsets, for example. So it really, I think one of the reasons why we were able to do these things is because we are very human-centric in terms of intelligence, but really, as ChatGPT showed, language is actually not that hard to get from a machine perspective. What is actually more harder is understanding the physical world. And understanding the physical world, understanding sounds is something not just humans, but also lots of animals can do. In fact, lots of animals, a tiny fly can navigate with a small number of neurons, can navigate, can understand sounds, sometimes better than humans. And that's the reason why when you're trying to understand and manipulate the physical world rather than just focusing on language understanding, you can get away with really tiny models, which is what we're showing in our work.
Thank you so much. This was a very stimulating discussion. I would like to invite our next speaker, Professor Mahmood Kuria, who is the winner of the Infosys Prize in Humanities and Social Sciences, chosen by the jury headed by Professor Akhil Bilgrami. The jury awards him for his pioneering research on Maritime Islam, particularly in Kerala. His work has enriched the understanding of Islamic law's impact on economic, political, and cultural transformations in the Indian Ocean region.
Thank you. Hesitant clap. But first and foremost, thanks to the foundation as well as the board and jury for giving me the opportunity to share part of my work. I'll start with a poem from while visiting Cochin in the late decades of the 16th century, the Sanskrit poet Melpattur Narayana Bhattathiri was amazed to see some white Europeans roaming around the city. He poetized his amuse by saying, the last two lines, Kanjukanda Kinjidya Veshiniya Vibandura Vadana Bimbeha Parasiga Logai Sanjarishnu Birubarubadhyamana Nigilamarge. Along with many other descriptions about the weapons and the dresses that the Portuguese wear, as you can spot in the first part of the passage, he concludes the poem or the stanza by saying that because these Parasigans or the Portuguese who are noticeable with their white faces are traveling through the areas, some passages in the city are blocked to the local people. Probably this is the earliest reference we have on the Portuguese in India in an Indian language, something that I have been interested for a long time. We have so many books on the Portuguese or even Europeans in India, but almost all of these are based on European sources. How about Indian sources? Didn't Indians who were at the receiving end of the so-called age of explorations of Europeans note down anything about the arrival of Europeans? This led me to translate one of the first Malayalam war songs as one of my first publications on the battle between the Portuguese and the Dutch happened in Cochin, again in the 1660s, titled Padappattu. Interestingly, in this poem, the poet apologizes for the deviation from the long existing bhakti themes in Malayalam poetry. But such deviations in the poetry make the intellectual or historical inquiries more interesting as they represent the ruptures in history. So going back to Narayana Bhattathiri, his remark is possibly not only the earliest notice of Portuguese in Sanskrit, but in any Indian language. His text, Goshri Nagara Varnana, is not only not his only work, and the Portuguese are not the only community he encountered in Cochin. Narayana Bhattathiri is best known in Kerala for his Narayaniyam, a finest Sanskrit work of religious lyrics in praise of Narayana, focusing on the themes of the Bhagavata Purana, along with a summarized version of Ramayana. But its date of composition is sort of given mathematically in an interesting Kali chronogram at the end of the text. However, he is best known among scholars for his works in philosophy and linguistics, but also in religion, ethics, eulogies, and prashastis, a polymath in true sense. Narayana was part of the a long Kerala school of science, I would say. Specifically in mathematics, starting with the famous mathematician Madhava in the 14th century. The school developed in conversation with the mathematical tradition within the region, but also outside the region, especially from Arabo-Persia. We know such exchanges happen in the so-called golden age of the Indian or Arabo-Persian sciences. But how about the exchanges after the so-called golden ages, both in India as well as in Arabo-Persia? So that is where the Indian Ocean comes in. Thanks to the Indian Ocean and the monsoon winds that carried people back and forth along with in the ships, these exchanges continued, not only in trade, but also in scientific and intellectual and philosophical exchanges. To understand this, a vernacular language such as Malayalam, as well as the vernacular versions of Sanskrit, are very important. We have a long list of works, scientific works produced from the 12th century onward, thanks to the interactions between the Arab and Indian worlds. I'm saving you from the details of all the scientific works, but Narayana Bhattadiri's remarks on the Portuguese, these were part of the reflections on the larger world of the exchanges that he noticed in Cochin in the late 16th century. However, his contemporary, Pundanam Nambudiri, was not amused with such ravenousness for profit. And yet he reflected on the diverse trade that was happening in the Kerala coast. I'll skip the Malayalam part and then basically which translate the Narayana Nambudiri, Pundanam Nambudiri is saying that some people are trading in gold and gems in the first part, infinitely. A few others are trading even in elephants and finest horses. Yet another group is profiting from building ships. But he is disinterested in all these things. Shiva Shiva, what to earn from so much wealth. Just within 20 miles away from Pundanam as well as Melpatur lived another important family who also wrote extensively about the Portuguese, but also polymaths of equal stature. And here comes one person who wrote, his name is Sheikh Zainuddin al-Makhdoom. And he wrote this text called Tahreed Ahl al-Iman within just 10 years after the Portuguese arrived on Indian coast. In the poem, he asks his audience to resist the Portuguese attacks on the land, but also conceptualizes the local kingdom, its Hindu ruler, the Zamorans, as well as an ideal place for any human being to live. And for him, it doesn't make sense why the Portuguese introduces a lot of attack in order to trade in the region. And the sentiment is shared by his successors, immediate successors, as well as contemporaries like another poet called Qadi Muhammad. And his text, Fathul Mubin, the title itself identifies the local Hindu ruler as Muhibbul Muslimin, or the lover of Muslims. Both of them appreciate the Zamorans so much, but also depreciates many other Muslim rulers who didn't come to the help of local traders and local people who were being targeted on the oceanic waters, which now the Portuguese wanted to monopolize. Sheikh Zainuddin's grandson, also named Sheikh Zainuddin, wrote another most elaborate historical account of the Portuguese called Tuhfat al-Mujahidin, which not only chronicles the Portuguese in the region and the broader Indian Ocean world, but also provides a detailed history of the region itself. This work in Arabic is often identified as the first systematic historical account of Kerala, and Zainuddin is often identified as the first historian of Kerala as well. Together, these poets and jurists devised theological, juridical, and political standpoints arguing for the duty and responsibility of the local people, including Muslims, to fight for the Hindu ruler, and identifies Kerala and Malabar in their terms the most harmonious place that a Muslim could aspire for. This line of thought, from the early 16th century, continues until the end of the 16th century. Interestingly, like Narayana Bhattadiri, Makhdum's main works were not concerning the Portuguese. Rather, like Bhattadiri, he was interested in the question of religion. For one of them was bhakti and karma, while for the Makhdum, it was karma from a different sort, what he would identify as karma shastra or the fiqh, translated into Malayalam as such. The confluence between the karma and bhakti, as much as karma shastra, fiqh, and bhakti, the tasawwuf, lay at the core of their lifetime engagement. And this is something that I have been trying to look at in my first single-authored monograph, the same work but different edition, Islamic Law in Circulation, which explored how one particular school of Islamic law, Shafi'ism, spread across the Eastern Mediterranean and the Indian Ocean world. I did this by looking at the predecessors and successors of this one particular scholar that I just mentioned, Sheikh Zainuddin from 16th century Kerala. So his text, Fathul Mu'in, is widely circulated across the Indian Ocean from East Africa, in South Arabia, as well as South Asia and Southeast Asia. And people, even today in 21st century, while I go to whether in the highlands of Comoros or in the lowlands of, hinterlands of Java in Indonesia, people relate with this text because of Al-Malaybari, or the text that he produced several centuries earlier. The Ponnani Makhdums, as the family is known, were being creative and critical and organic intellectuals in articulating their local necessities and situations in the larger vocabularies available to them. And these are some texts that I worked with in the book itself, but also the long genealogy of the text that goes back into the 9th century. And the text attracted a lot of commentaries, at least an Indian text attracting 40 commentaries from different parts of the world, going back to 18th century, 19th century, and 20th century. This is something that we see in a text like this, which is a commentary by an Egyptian scholar on an Indian text in late 19th century, as well as this one by an Indonesian scholar from Java based in Mecca in 19th century. And then we have many more similar commentaries from Yemen, Syria, and so forth. Interestingly, Zainuddin could have a conversation with these scholars from different parts of the world thanks to the work that he produced, mainly in Arabic, but that doesn't mean that he wasn't well-versed in the local language. The choices that Bhattadiri as well as Zainuddin made in terms of the language that they could interact with their audience contributed to their wider reception across the world. So I will leave you with few quick thoughts. These are, again, going back to the wider circulation. But these are few thoughts, 4 broad thoughts. One is the intellectual agency of those who lived, especially after the so-called golden age of the science or mathematics or law after the 1st century, as well as the importance of vernaculars in this whole repertoire, along with the larger languages, something like Arabic, Persian, but also Sanskrit, which is very important. And finally, whether we forget the ocean and continue to view history solely within the borders of land or not, the ocean doesn't forget us. It continues to shape our lives and worlds. And then, therefore, let us examine both the past and the present from the ocean's perspective and the kind of interactions that facilitated and continue to facilitate across the vast terrain of the world. And therefore, it would encourage us to remain, to be sensitive to the larger cosmopolis of ideas that existed across the oceanic world. Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you. If there are any questions, please raise your hand and we'll give you a mic. Okay, so I understand we've had 3 speakers. Oh, sorry, wait. No, I'm just saying we've had 3 speakers. We will have this Q&A, and then we have a 10-minute bio break, after which we come back. But first, a question.
So, Mehmet, could you say a little bit about why you are so focused on Shafi and that particular text, and what is driving you to to focus so much on that text, since the circulation is presumed?
Definitely, mainly because, interestingly, while the rest of the subcontinent, Indian subcontinent, predominantly follow this other Sunni legal school called Hanafi school, only in places like Kerala, Tamil Nadu, and parts of Karnataka, the Konkan coast, we have historically the Shafi community. And it doesn't make sense in the subcontinental perspective. And I wanted to see why, people like in Kerala or Muslims in Kerala follow this particular version of Islamic law. And that makes sense only if you look at the larger Indian Ocean world. And interestingly, this particular school is followed from South Africa, from Cape Town, up to a place like Maguindanao in the Philippines. While, across the Indian Ocean, that is the most important school, which is not the case in the rest of the places like Indian subcontinent or the Central Asia or other places. Yeah.
If anyone else has a question, now is the time to ask. Otherwise, we have a 10-minute bio break, and then I would request you all to be back in the room, if possible, by 4:40 or 4:42. Thank you, Professor Mehul.
Something about a non-equilibrial matter state.
A time crystal.
Hello. Swati, Serene, can you guys usher people in? I request everyone to settle down so we can hear from our next speaker. For those outside, please bring your cup of tea inside. Someone needs to say it louder. Are you ready? You're ready, right? So we'll begin. I think when I here we are. No. So I think we've had enough time to feed our minds and take a break. I am pleased to invite to the stage Professor Siddesh Kamath, who is the winner of the Life Sciences Infosys Prize 2024. The panel, headed by Professor Mrigank Sur, has awarded Professor Kamath for his discoveries concerning bioactive lipids and their roles in cellular functions and human disease. Welcome, Professor Kamath.
Okay, so I've sort of split my talk into two parts, where I'm going to sort of briefly summarize what we have done in lab in terms of the actual scientific problems. And the second part is going to be some of the technologies we are developing and how we can apply them to address certain questions. So my lab sort of dwells in different areas of biology and chemistry. We work at the interface of biology and chemistry, use different sort of tools, technologies to address our problems. We largely work with lipids, and if you look at a cell, you will find that lipids do several things. First, lipids are involved as structural elements that define boundaries of cells. They prevent things from getting in and out of cells. They're very hydrophobic. They prevent water getting in and out and different things getting in and out. Second, they are a source of energy. So the cell stores lipids in the form of particles called lipid droplets, and these are burned for energy later on. The third is an emerging sort of paradigm in lipid biology, which are bioactive lipids. And lipids are thought to function like hormones and regulate different biological processes. The prostaglandins are a classical example of this class of lipids. They've won 2-3 Nobel Prizes for their discoveries and use in biomedicine. So the lipid that we work with largely in lab is a lipid called lysophosphatidylserine. And you can see how nature has stitched 3 fundamental building blocks of life together to make one molecule. It has an amino acid, it has a sugar, and it has a lipid tail. And so when we started the lab, there was a little bit known about the role of these lipids in human diseases, but there was no way of accessing these lipids because there were very few companies, or rather no companies, that made them when we started the lab. And the idea for us was to first make these lipids and study their biology. So over the years, we have developed really nice ways of making these lipids, accessing them in different biological systems. And the questions that we have been addressing is, how are these lipids made in cells? What do they do in cells? Where are they present? Can we develop model systems to sort of simulate what they do in the context of human diseases? So just to give you a screenshot of what we have done over the last 7-8 years, is we found enzymes that make these lipids. We found enzymes that break these lipids. We found enzymes that recycle these lipids. And by modulating the activities of these enzymes, we have been able to map out different receptors that these lipids target in biological systems and understand their roles in different human diseases. So to give you a snapshot of what we have been able to do over the past few years, is we have shown that these lipids regulate different sort of allergic responses. So it has implications in histamine release. So it has a direct access to making antihistamine-like molecules. We've shown its role in different immune systems, in communication between different immune cells. We've shown its role in resolving inflammation and regulating different sort of infections. Not us, but other labs in the world have used information generated by us to show the roles of these lipids in different cancers and in how this lipid is involved in regulating glucose metabolism, specifically in the brain. So what our research on this lipid has done over the past few years, it has opened numerous opportunities in developing drugs in the immune system, in the brain, in cancer, in different contexts, based on basic biology things that are happening in our lab. Another area of research that we are looking at is looking at a process called oxidative stress. And this is central to a lot of diseases where the cellular oxidation is more powerful than the reduction potential in the cell. And this causes a whole bunch of important biomolecules such as lipids, proteins, nucleic acids to get oxidized. And more recently, lipids are becoming very important in a process called ferroptosis. Ferroptosis is the ability of your body to overcome these mechanisms, and they've been largely studied in the context of neurodegenerative diseases, cancers, even metabolic diseases such as diabetes and hypertension, and more recently in the context of COVID-19. What we have done is, if you look at lipids, they contain a double bond, very simple chemistry. And what happens when you subject a double bond to a reactive oxygen species is you have a whole bunch of permutations and combinations that end up chemically in the cell. Now, when you start with tens and thousands of such molecules, you have n number of such combinations. And what our group has been doing over the past few years is we're using a technology called mass spectrometry to deconvolute what are these oxidized lipids in biological systems. Whether we can map them, we can understand which one of them are biologically important, and then over time develop different sort of models such as cellular models, animal models, or even in vitro models where we can purify systems and study them in the context of biological systems. So this is something we are doing very actively with a number of collaborators within the country. Now, if one walks into a biology lab, one sees a picture like this pasted on most walls of a biology lab. This is a very complex picture of all the metabolic pathways in a cell. However, in reality, what's happening is post-genome sequencing, we know that all the pathways that are published in this picture is under conditions of normal. We don't know what is happening in the context of diseases. We don't know what is happening in the context of abnormal conditions. And genome sequencing basically has told us that there are a whole bunch of pathways which we don't know anything about. And the idea is to figure out what these pathways do so we can intervene and reverse them. Now, over the past 2 decades, the NIH in particular has invested a lot of money in this problem. They have set up these really large consortiums which are over $300-400 million in funding. And what they're trying to do is exactly address these problems. And I was associated with a couple of these consortiums while I was doing my PhD and postdoc. And that sort of has been a motivation for what we do in the lab. Now, why is there such a big disconnect in our understanding of biological pathways? So, the central dogma of biology tells us that DNA makes RNA, RNA makes protein, and then proteins do a whole bunch of things in cells. Now, if you look at large-scale technologies that are available, there is genomics for DNA, there is transcriptomics for RNA, and there is proteomics for protein. But there is a disconnect thereafter in understanding what proteins do physiologically and whether we can assign functions to proteins. So realizing this gap, what we and others in the world are also doing is developing biochemical technologies to bridge this gap. So we are developing high-throughput biochemical technologies to assign functions to proteins and figure out what they're doing under normal physiological conditions or in the context of diseases. So 2 technologies that my lab has been actively developing, one of them is called ABPP, or activity-based protein profiling, and the second is a more global technology which is called metabolomics, and since we do a lot of work with lipids, it's called lipidomics. So I'll give you a brief flavor of both these technologies in the next couple of minutes. Oops, I don't know why this slide came later on, but I'll skip through this. So metabolomics is a large-scale measurements of different metabolites in the cell. Okay? And what we do is we take different biological samples. We are agnostic of the biological samples. They can be anything. They can be anything from a bacteria to a human. And we basically take these tissues or biological samples, we subject them to different sort of extraction procedures, and we take these extracts, put them through a mass spec, and read out what comes out of a mass spec. And based on the readouts that we get, we can establish functions to different proteins. This also requires a high degree of machine learning and AI algorithms, which we work with a lot of mass spec companies to do. So how does one get this? So we basically, in a single mass spec run, we can measure up to 2,000 unique metabolites in the cell. So at any given point, there are about 5,000-6,000 metabolites that are constantly fluxing. A large part you cannot measure because they are very, very low in abundance or they're degraded very fast. But what can one measure is about 2,000 metabolites, and a large portion of them that we measure in lipidated products. Now, the way we integrate metabolomics to assigning functions to proteins is we will take a particular protein and we will disturb its activity. This can be done using inhibitors, this can be done using genetics, or this can be done using model systems. And when you have comparative samples from a normal system and a system where you have disrupted proteins, you find that there are specific changes in these metabolites, and based on that and chemical intuition, one can go back and assign functions to proteins. And this has proved a very powerful tool and has enabled us to almost, amplify the amount of proteins whose functions we can assign. So using this technology, we have, addressed a whole bunch of questions. So we have figured out how lipid glucose metabolism happens under physiological conditions. We have figured out how lipid transport happens from the liver. We figured out how lipid pathways are dysregulated in the context of cancer, how bacteria produce secondary metabolites to overcome or cause infection, and we have also applied these to academic non-model mammalian systems such as flies, yeast, or even zebrafish to assign functions to proteins. And as you can see, we work with these systems with a whole bunch of collaborators. We try to apply these systems to their system. Their systems in turn help us refine and define our technologies. In the last minute or so, I will tell you about another technology which is called activity-based protein profiling. And this starts off with a chemistry effort where we develop something which is called an activity-based probe. And here are some of the properties of an activity-based probe. Now, an activity-based probe that we routinely use in lab is a molecule called fluorophosphonate rhodamine. And this molecule basically uses differential reactivity of amino acids that are present on the surface of a protein versus the inside of a protein, which is actually going to do the biological activity. And based on these differential reactivities of amino acids, we can develop these activity-based probes. Now, these activity-based probes come in different flavors. They come in flavors where you can visualize them on things in biology which are called gels, or you can make it more complex and read them out using an analytical technique called mass spectrometry. And we use both of these in tandem to address several problems in the lab. And again, some of the problems that we have been able to address over the years is antibiotic resistance is becoming a huge problem. And we are trying to use these technologies to find new targets for such drug-resistant antibiotics. We are also finding new pockets to which we can develop drugs in the human proteome, and we're also applying them to physiological systems. So the idea for us is we want to develop new technologies to bridge this gap of annotating functions to proteins. And none of these efforts would have been possible without a wonderful group of students, past and present, a lot of funding from different agencies, and a wonderful set of collaborators that I have. And this is the picture of all the people whose work I've spoken about today. Thank you very much to the Infosys Science Foundation for allowing me the opportunity to speak today.
Thanks. And if there are any questions, please raise your hand. We'll hand you the microphone. I thought I saw a hand. Yeah, there's one person at the back, please.
So, nice talk, Siddesh. So this annotated function based on metabolomics,
some of these functions would be dependent on different protein coming together and making a complex. So how would you resolve those kind of issues with metabolomics if there are large complexes working together?
So as I said, we do it using a combination of applications. We'll use it. We're doing pharmacology. We'll use genetics. We'll use model systems. So if you disturb the function in more than one way, you almost always see an effect. And that's how we are able to trace the function of a protein to different sets of metabolites and stitch them in and come to the answer at the end.
Okay, thanks.
So Sudesh, wonderful work. But I was wondering whether you could comment briefly on the fact that lipids are actually involved in a lot of things, including diseases like Alzheimer's disease, where phospholipids are crucially involved in the formation of amyloid plaques, etc. So, and in many other diseases. I wonder whether you could comment for a non-specialist audience how your work on lysophosphatidyls, serine, might apply to a broader class of lipid functions and in particular diseases.
So, yeah.
I just want to add, you're looking at multiple identification of multiple proteins and things like that. Is there an attempt to take one to closure to create a diagnostic tool or diagnostic practical application? Is there an attempt to do that?
So I'll answer his question first and then your question. So the lipids that you spoke about, phospholipids, for example, these are very, very abundant proteins. Very, very abundant lipids. They are essentially the structural components of your cell wall. So what happens in conditions such as Alzheimer's or neurodegenerative diseases of those sort are diseases where these proteins basically coat these plaques. They're very, very abundant proteins. We don't do too much work on that class of lipids. What we are looking at are very, very poorly abundant lipids. They're almost hormone-like signaling lipids. So they are very low in concentrations because they are very potent in the signaling activities that they do in biology. So our goal is to A, identify such lipids, and B, figure out how they are made and what signaling they do. So in the context, in the broad sense, we are looking at a very poorly abundant, very small class of lipids which have very profound biological activities. Coming to your question, so the work we spoke about lysophosphatidyl it started off identifying these lipids, identifying these enzymes, and now 2 of these enzymes are worked on by at least 4 pharma companies that we know of who have approached us, and they're developing drugs to target neurodegenerative diseases and are looking for applications in cancer. So we start off broad, but we narrow down to 1 or 2 enzymes eventually in every problem, and that we hope to take forward. That's the idea.
Do we have any more questions in the room? I know that a lot of people would like to approach you over tea, but I think right now we will wind this up. Thank you so much. I'm excited to introduce you to the Infosys Prize in Physical Sciences winner, Professor Vedika Khemani from Stanford. The jury, headed by Professor Srinivas Kulkarni, awarded her for her contributions to non-equilibrium quantum matter, including the discovery of time crystals. Sounds very exciting. Waiting to hear from you.
Hey, thank you all for being here. I'm really excited to tell you about some fun new directions in many body. Whoa. It's my entire, okay. Some fun new directions in many body quantum physics. Sorry, what's happening with this? Is it on? Is it on some play mode? Oh. Can you not do it on a play mode? Okay.
So we'll have a lot of quantum jokes. But
the slides are in a superposition.
Yeah. Can you just press on to the next slide manually, maybe the first slide, in the meanwhile, so she can begin?
Yeah.
Can you go there manually, the next slide? Yeah.
Which previous PPT? This is the same one. I don't know. Sorry? Okay.
He's saying, yeah. Do you want to begin? Can you, or would you like to wait?
I'd like to wait.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, okay, never mind. Okay. Does anyone know a quantum joke? What did Heisenberg say when he was pulled over by a cop? If you know where I am, you have no idea how fast I was going. So.
Okay. Give us another minute. Really sorry about this, everyone. So while we try and fix that snafu, if anyone has questions for any of the previously, now seems to be a good time to ask. Okay, everyone is saving it for high tea, which we will have just after Professor Kimani and the next speaker. So 2 speakers, and then we have high tea. It's going in autoplay mode. They're trying to fix it.
Can I hook up my laptop?
Yes.
Should I do that?
I think if she hooks up her laptop, that'll help. Yes.
Should I do that now?
Yeah, everyone did. Everyone has to.
So where should I hook up mine?
Could you take this laptop, please?
Oh, in the podium. Okay. Sorry, give me 1 second.
Just try now. I think it's working.
Oh, you think it's working now?
Try once. Yes.
Okay. All right. No, it's working. It's working. Don't touch it. Okay. All right. So as a condensed matter physicist, I study the emergent properties of complex systems composed of many, many simple entities, all interacting with each other. Emergence is the idea of complexity arising from simplicity, that the whole can be much greater than the sum of its parts. This is a powerful idea that cuts across many different scientific fields and scales, and has played an important role at every stage in the evolution of our universe, from the formation of galaxy clusters, to the description of ant colonies and bird flocks, to the evolution of cognition and life itself. Emergence reveals stunning new phenomena that simply cannot be understood by studying the properties of one or few entities in isolation, just as we cannot understand the behavior of an ant colony or a human society or the brain by studying a single ant or a single individual or a single neuron. In other words, more is different. All stuff on Earth that we see, this plethora of phases of matter, from everyday solids, liquids, and gases, to more exotic semiconductors and superconductors and liquid crystals that have driven our modern technological and information age, all of this arises from simple electrical charges, atoms, ions, electrons, all interacting with each other via the laws of electromagnetism and quantum mechanics, and self-assembling into different emergent structures. I want to emphasize here that all of these phases describe the properties of different materials, for example, silicon, existing in equilibrium in nature. However, despite the vast array of amazing new phases that we continue to discover every day and that have shown to be important in our modern age, all of this rich diversity is a tiny, tiny, tiny corner of the set of allowed states that can exist according to the rules of quantum mechanics. Okay? Hilbert space, which is the space that defines quantum states, is a vast multidimensional space. And the set of states describing equilibrium phases of matter is a tiny, tiny, tiny corner of this vast space. Indeed, the most general quantum mechanical description of a physical system is a fundamentally out of equilibrium process composed of unitary time evolution, according to Schrödinger's equation, interrupted by quantum measurements. But if nature only gives us access to quantum materials in equilibrium, how do we access this vastly larger space of quantum states and evolutions? Well, as scientists, our role isn't simply to passively observe, understand, and describe nature, but also to recreate, shape, and mold our physical reality. So we can ask, what new phenomena can emerge if we could make individual quantum particles controllably interact according to rules of our choice? This dream is now becoming a reality. Motivated by the quest to build quantum computers, there have been breakthrough advances in the development of quantum simulators across a variety of platforms ranging from neutral atoms to trapped ions to superconducting qubits. Each of these different platforms represents a many-body complex system of many, many interacting quantum particles, but where we have individual control, remarkable, unprecedented control over individual quantum entities or quantum particles. This video is from an experimental group. I'm a theorist, so I can take no credit for this. It's supposed to keep playing. Let's go back. Let's play this again. So this video is from an experiment in Misha Lukin's group at Harvard, which is trying to build a quantum computer out of a system of neutral atoms. And what you're seeing here is a system where you can individually address every single atom in this system. And this is a small subset of a system of thousands of atoms. You can pick them up, move them around, get them to interact with other atoms, and use this to enact a quantum evolution controllably of your choice. The goal ultimately, of course, is to implement some desired quantum algorithm. But any algorithm is a fundamentally non-equilibrium process. You have in mind some input. The input is acted upon by some operations. If we were looking at algorithms in our conventional classical computers, these would be AND gates or OR gates or familiar logic gates. In a quantum computer, these operations are quantum gates, but these are just interactions among our quantum degrees of freedom. So you take in an input, you act on it with some gates, and then you get out an output. This is a controlled non-equilibrium quantum process where you have programmable interactions and you have access to non-equilibrium dynamics. So this is a fundamentally new regime for many-body physics, and we can ask, what are new types of phenomena, new types of phases that we can get, new emergent phenomena, when we're considering systems of many quantum particles in this fundamentally out of equilibrium setting. Star Trek is frozen.
Something about a non-equilibrium matter state.
A time crystal.
So let me tell you a little bit about a non-equilibrium matter state that we had a lot of fun working on for the last several years, which is called a time crystal. And this is an example of one of these new types of phases which do not have an analog in the equilibrium setting, but which have found a new life in this new regime of many-body physics. So, what are crystals? Okay, when you think of crystals, you probably imagine some pretty gemstones and pretty objects that you want to own. That's me. I'm the condensed matter physicist over there. But to a condensed matter physicist or to a physicist, a crystal is actually much more beautiful than these images that you could imagine. A crystal is something that we understand in terms of the fundamental symmetries of nature. Okay. So one of the most fundamental symmetries of nature is that of spatial translation symmetry. This tells you that the laws of nature are the same everywhere. Okay? If you do an experiment here in Bangalore or I do an experiment in Stanford, I expect to get the same results. Okay? A crystal, then, is a phase of matter which spontaneously breaks that symmetry. So in a crystal, the arrangement of atoms does not look the same everywhere. You can see that there's periodic spatial variations. There's an atom in some location, and then not in a different one, and then there's another atom in a different location. In this room, the fact that the chairs are arranged in a definite pattern has broken the translation symmetry of the room. In contrast, a liquid or a gas state statistically looks the same everywhere, and that's a symmetric phase. So if the chairs were not in this room and everyone was milling around so that every location was the same as every other, that would be a symmetric phase, whereas this crystal has spontaneously broken the symmetry. Now, just like spatial translation symmetry, we also have time translation symmetry. The laws of nature don't change from one day to another. Okay, the experiments that Newton did back in the day continue to inform what happens if a ball rolls it on an inclined plane today. So you can ask the question, what about a time crystal? Could you have a phase of matter that spontaneously breaks time translation symmetry so that in a time crystal, this phase should show you periodic variations in time and not look the same at any moment in time? So what this would mean, conceptually, is you would have access to some kind of many-body system whose state repeats periodically in time forever without any net input of energy, okay? Because that's the spontaneous part of it. So imagine you had this pendulum clock, and you set it going, and you wound it up, but imagine it could then run forever without ever needing to be wound up again. This starts sounding perpetually close to a perpetual motion, or perilously close to a perpetual motion machine, which humans have dreamed about for many, many centuries, and which have roundly been rejected by the laws of thermodynamics. Okay? The first law of thermodynamics tells you that perpetual motion needs a source of energy. So there is friction, and if you set this pendulum bob going, it's going to eventually come to rest. If I live in a theorist's world and I ignore friction and I say I've stuck my pendulum into a frictionless bell jar, well, I still have to contend with the second law of thermodynamics, which tells me that the bob of this pendulum, is actually a many-body object made up of many, many, many interacting atoms. And over time, the second law of thermodynamics tells me that the energy will dissipate from the center of mass mode into the numerous other internal modes of the pendulum, because there's many, many more ways. Second law of thermodynamics maximizes entropy. There's many, many more ways for this energy to be distributed among these many internal modes, and the pendulum will come to rest. Okay? So indeed, time crystals were proposed first by Frank Wilczek in 2012. The idea was met with a lot of excitement, but almost immediately after this proposal, these were proven, there were mathematical papers which showed that this phase is provably impossible. Okay? So when my collaborators and I were working on this, we weren't setting out to find a time crystal. We were working in a very, very different corner of physics. We were studying non-equilibrium quantum phases, non-equilibrium quantum systems, and lo and behold, the rules which forbid you from having this kind of impossible-sounding phase in equilibrium simply don't apply in the setting in which we were working, and we were able to find a realization of this phase. Okay? Let me tell you a little bit about that. So doing that requires actually going back all the way to Phil Anderson's Nobel Prize-winning work in 1958 on the subject of localization. Okay? So in quantum mechanics, one of the most fundamental tenets is that of wave-particle duality. Okay? So I started with that joke on Heisenberg. Okay, so in quantum mechanics, quantum particles do not have a definite position or state. Until you look, it only has a probability of being in many different states. Okay, you can imagine the particle with a wave, and the wave is telling you the probability of finding a particle somewhere. Okay. Now, according to the second law of thermodynamics, your particle is going to want to explore all the space that's available to it. That corresponds to a wave that is spread out everywhere. On the other hand, what Phil Anderson showed is that if you have impurities or dirt in your system, your wave can get localized. Okay? So your wave can remain stuck in one little corner of the system. That's like saying, suppose you started with some red gas in that corner of the room, you expect that would spread out and occupy the entire space. On the other hand, because of localization, that gas could remain stuck just in that corner of the room. Okay? So Phil Anderson showed this for single particles. Then this led to the work on many body localization, which tells you, this was many, many, many years later, which says that even a system of many, many particles all interacting with each other, that's the many body, can actually remain localized or stuck in the state in which they started. Okay, so the second law of thermodynamics, which tells you that the particles will explore all of state space, do not apply to this class of systems. So this is actual experimental data from an experiment that I was involved in. In this localized phase, what you're seeing here is an actual atomic trap with atoms started off in the left half of the trap, and then you let the system evolve in time, and what you find is that you go as long as the experiment lets you go, and you find that the atoms are still preferentially stuck just in the left half of the trap. Okay? They don't explore all of state space. On the other hand, in this other phase, which is not localized, you set your system off, and as you would expect, if you started with all the air in one half of the room, it would spread out and occupy all of phase space, all of the space. Okay? So localized systems remain stuck where they start. In a many-body localized time crystal, the setup that you need is that you have a many-body localized system which is periodically driven in time, but it's periodically driven in a way that there's no net energy input from the drive. And now the system breaks this symmetry of this periodic driving and responds at twice the driving period. So you've already, by doing the drive, you've imposed a periodicity on your system. Imagine that all of these chairs are set up in this room. But now your system is responding at twice the period. So imagine that the people that are sitting in this room were sitting with every other chair occupied. So you've broken that translation symmetry of the drive, and you have this kind of time crystal, which is going to oscillate between different localized states from ever if isolated from the environment. Okay, so this is a robust, and this behavior is robust to all sorts of changes in the interactions in the system and the parameters in the system. It's a robust new out-of-equilibrium phase of matter. It's a new kind of paradigm for the phases of matter that can exist in many-body systems. So the theoretical formulation of this phase was actually done several years ago. And then there was a long kind of period between the theory and an actual experimental realization which checked all the boxes. And to actually realize this phase experimentally, we had to wait for all of these developments that I was telling you about on quantum computing to get these types of tunable platforms where you could engineer the interactions that you need to see this phase, and you can engineer the types of observables that you need to see this kind of persistent oscillation for the duration of the experiment. Okay, so I want to again emphasize that this is a time-dependent system which is not observed in the wild, in nature, but it can be observed in this synthetic quantum system. Okay? So just a minute on what's beyond. Okay? These devices are giving us access to other new regimes. Time crystals are just the tip of the iceberg. They're just a striking example. But the world of new states and new phases that we have to explore is really, really vast. So, we've been thinking quite a lot about dynamics with quantum measurements. Measurements, Einstein famously described quantum measurements as spooky action at a distance. Measurements in quantum mechanics can have a dramatic effect on creating and restructuring quantum correlations. We can ask about new families of dynamics with quantum measurements. And if you're in the game of programmably getting particles to interact with each other, we're not limited to Euclidean spaces in 3 dimensions. We can make them interact in geometries of our choice. So in particular, they can interact in various non-Euclidean graphs, expander graphs, and you can get new types of phases in these settings as well. Okay? So to zoom out, the big picture is that there's a big push to build these fantastic new engineered quantum devices. They may be useful for quantum technologies down the line, but already today, they're fantastic new classes of novel physical experiments, which are opening up vast new frontiers for many-body physics. And these new physical insights that we get by studying these new types of phases in matter should, in turn, influence the development of new technologies and new devices going forward. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the quantum joke in the beginning, but does anyone else have a question now? I know that we all wanted to listen to more. Yeah, there's one question in the back.
That when you were talking about localization, many-body localization, you are addressing the wave aspect, right?
Yes.
But when you're talking about quantum matter and quantum computing, if I want to think about in Dirac's state, neither wave nor particle, just a state of all the particles in the bigger Hilbert space.
Yes.
How would what would be your implication there?
Good. Yeah. So when you talk about many-body localization, you can visualize it as a kind of localization in Hilbert space. So you have a state which you can talk about the particle is here, there. You started off somewhere, and then thermalization or the lack of localization would mean that this state then in time would explore all of the different states available to it, versus remaining stuck in the corner of Hilbert space where it started. So that's what many-body localization would mean, that you retain some local memory of the state in which you start.
Thanks for that beautiful presentation. The question I had was about, quantum effects can also happen at larger scales. So what about here? I mean, do you see similar phenomena at much larger scales than the atomic or the subatomic?
So here we're not probing those. So we are looking at it is a system of hundreds of atoms. So, and it can potentially go to thousands of atoms. And the beauty of these platforms is that you can image the system of 1,000 atoms, and you can see exactly where the atoms are. And then you're asking about, do they remain stuck where they started, and then do they flip between different states? So it is a system of many, many atoms, but we are looking at kind of the individual atomic scale to deduce localization. Yeah.
Yeah, there's one more question there.
Hello. I'm not from the world of quantum mechanics, but I have heard of this Conway's game of life, which comes from the 1970s.
Yes.
So there, in that game of life, we see that sometimes the system oscillates between a few states. Sometimes it gets localized in a particular corner, or in other cases, it spreads. So do you see any parallel between that world of classical maths and the world of quantum?
Yeah, absolutely. So indeed, when I said in the end we're starting to think about dynamics with measurements and so on, one of the things that you're thinking about is like a general quantum process which has some time evolution, some measurement, some feedback, because in the rule of life, you can think of it like a cellular automata. You program some rules. You say, if my neighbor is doing something, then do something. And we're starting to ask those questions with quantum systems as well, which is, when you allow for that class of general evolutions, what new types of behaviors can you get? And indeed, can you get this kind of persistent oscillation? Can you get some dynamical phases which are not just, where you can tune between different types of phases by tuning different parameters. So we're absolutely playing those kinds of games with quantum systems as well now. Yeah.
We have time for one more question. Okay. So with that, we'll take this over tea if there's anything else. Thank you so much, Professor Kimani. The last talk of the evening is by Professor Neena Gupta from the Indian Statistical Institute, Calcutta. Professor Gupta is the Infosys Prize winner in Mathematical Sciences and has been recognized by a jury headed by Professor Chandrasekhar Khare. She is being awarded for solving the Zariski cancellation problem in algebraic geometry. I will not attempt to explain more of that, but her work has significant impact on this particular field. Professor Gupta couldn't be here with us today because she's giving the Emmy Noether lecture in the US. She very much regrets that she's not here, but she has recorded her talk. And I request you to please play the video.
Good afternoon. It is indeed a matter of great pleasure for me to give this Infosys Symposium. Unfortunately, I'm not present here physically. Right now, I'm in USA, and yesterday I gave the invited Emmy Noether lecture in the AMS conference. Emmy Noether, she is a mother of modern algebra as well as the founder of my subject, commutative algebra. And I drew a lot of inspiration from the life and research of Emmy Noether. Let me pay my tribute to her and to Professor Sriram S. Abhyankar. He is a pioneer in the area of affine algebraic geometry, in which I am been working. In affine algebraic geometry, we study affine n spaces, which are the space Kn, where K is a field, which you can take it to be the complex number Cn or the field Rn, with a Zariski topology and some sheaf structure. And we study affine varieties, which are zero locus of some system of polynomial equations. For example, the conics like parabola or the hyperbola were studied algebraically using theory of quadratic equations. In general, the affine varieties may look very complicated, and they are studied algebraically through polynomial rings and their quotients by ideals using machineries and tools of commutative algebra. So in affine algebraic geometry, we study affine spaces and affine varieties. There are several challenging problems in the area of affine algebraic geometry, and some of which are easy to state, but not so easy to approach. And let me list down some problems. My research work touches upon almost all of this, except the first one. And today in this talk, I will discuss the problems 2 and 3, about which Freudenberg has remarked that a solution to the embedding problem or the cancellation problem for the affine spaces would reverberate across the whole of algebra. The main themes involved in some of these problems is to determine whether a given polynomial f is a coordinate, and that is whether there exists f2, f3, fn such that the polynomial ring kxn up to xn can be generated by the given polynomial f along with f2, f3, fn. And of special interest are the polynomials which are linear in one variable. Another important problem in my area is to determine whether a given ring A is isomorphic to a polynomial ring in n variables over the field K. And special interest are the rings A which are obtained by quotienting a linear polynomial. I will give by examples why linear polynomials have been playing a crucial role in my research. And throughout my talk, K will always denote a field of any characteristic. And for a ring R, the notation A equal to R square bracket N would mean that A is a polynomial ring in N indeterminate over the ring R. Let me start with the Zariski's cancellation problem. Zariski laid the foundation of modern algebraic geometry along with Andrew Weil and connected it with commutative algebra. The Zariski's cancellation problem for the affine n space A and K asks, suppose after adding a dimension to a variety V, if it is isomorphic to the affine n space, does it necessarily imply that the variety V is isomorphic to an affine space? Algebraically, you can ask, suppose a ring A, after adding an indeterminate to that, is isomorphic to a polynomial ring, does that necessarily imply that the ring A, which you start with, was originally a polynomial ring over a field K? So geometrically, we can represent it with this diagram. This picture was drawn by my student Ananya Pal for affine surfaces. So if V is an affine surface, and if you look at the affine cylinder over V, which is a three-dimensional space, suppose it is isomorphic to the affine 3 plane, does that necessarily imply that the affine surface which we have started with is isomorphic to the affine plane? So this is the cancellation problem for surfaces, and in higher dimension, this is not so easy to visualize. So this problem was known to have an affirmative answer for n equal to 1, and this was not so difficult. It was proved by Abhankar, Ikin, and Heinzer. Their result was much more general. They proved cancellation over one-dimensional cancellation over any ring R. However, the cancellation problem for the affine surface was not so easy, and it was proved by a series of results by Miyanishi and Sugi, and an important contribution by Fujita over a field of characteristic 0 first, and soon it was generalized over any field K of perfect characteristic perfect. And then recently we, along with Professor Bhatwadekar, we showed that the cancellation is true for arbitrary field over surfaces. And this research on this Zariski's cancellation problem for the affine surfaces had led to beautiful topological characterization of the affine plane by C.P. Ramanujan and algebraic characterization of the plane by Miyanishi. So C.P. Ramanujan, he gave the topological characterization for the affine plane, which is an important topic of research in today's time. And Professor Miyanishi, Russell, they were involved in proving the cancellation problem for the affine surfaces. And Gurjar also gave an algebraic proof of the cancellation for the affine plane by using the characterization for the C.P. Ramanujan. So what I showed is that I proved that for a field of positive characteristic, cancellation for the affine in 3 space and onwards is not true. In fact, this problem is still an open problem over a field of characteristic 0. And so my result for positive characteristic depends on an example constructed by Asanuma, which led to this counter example. And I'm thankful that Professor Asanuma visited us several times, and fortunately I could have very fruitful interactions with him, which led to my research in this cancellation problem. So this research on this Asanuma's threefold had opened up its connection with important problems and concepts in affine algebraic geometry, like the embedding problem and the affine fibration problem. So now I come to the embedding problem. So the embedding problem for the ask that suppose the 0 locus of a polynomial f represents an affine n-1 plane, does that 0 locus can be identified with a coordinate line? So algebraically, this means that if kxn up to xn modulo f is isomorphic to a polynomial in n-1 variable, does that necessarily imply that f is a coordinate? And this result was known to have an, so the case when n is equal to 2 and k is a field of characteristic 0, this is one of the most celebrated theorem known as the epimorphism theorem by Abhankar-Moe, and which was also independently proved by Suzuki over the complex number field, that any affine line is actually a coordinate. It's a highly non-trivial result with several different proofs known nowadays. And however, it was known that over a field of positive characteristic, there exist polynomials which represents a line but which cannot be an embedded line. That is, it cannot be made into a coordinate. And the Abhankar-Sathe's conjecture asserts an affirmative answer to this problem in characteristic 0 in higher dimension. This is completely an open problem in higher dimension. Some special cases have been taken care, and it has been seen that in some special cases, this Abhankar-Sathe conjecture can also be envisaged in arbitrary fields, over arbitrary fields. And for example, the first case for n equal to 3 was proved by, taken care by Sathe over characteristic 0 and Russell over arbitrary characteristic, where they considered G to be a linear polynomial in Y. So here G is a polynomial, linear polynomial in Y. Suppose G represents an affine plane, then they proved that G is actually a coordinate. In fact, they proved something more. So they proved that we can find a coordinate x1 in kxz such that the coefficient of y can be represented as a polynomial in one variable, and x1, and x1 is a coordinate along with, and G is a coordinate along with x1. Now, let me give you the importance of linear polynomials. So it has been seen that some breakthroughs on some central problems in affine algebraic geometry involved varieties which are defined by linear polynomials of the form a, y minus b, where a and b are polynomials in, the a is a polynomial in x and b is a polynomial in x, y, and z. For example, in the linearization problem, this famous ring A, which is a quotient of a polynomial ring in 4 variables by a linear polynomial in Y over the complex number. So this ring was constructed by Russell and Chorus, and it was an important open problem whether this ring A is isomorphic to a polynomial ring in 3 variables. So this was important because if the answer is no, then one could get a positive solution to the linearization conjecture for the C star actions on C3. And this was eventually proved by Makalimanov, and using the theory of GA actions on the affine threefolds. And he proved that this ring A is not a polynomial ring, which eventually led Chorus, Russell, Kaliman, and Makalimanov to complete their proof of the conjecture that C star action on C3 are linearizable. Another important example is this threefold, which has been constructed by Asanuma in the context of affine fibration problem and the linearization problem. And this is the ring which I considered. So this again is a linear polynomial in Y, and but here K is a field of positive characteristic. And Asanuma posed this problem whether this ring A is isomorphic to a polynomial ring in 3 variables. So if one can show that yes, then it would be give a counter example to the C star action on K3, where K is a field of positive characteristic. And if the answer is no, then this ring A is going to be a counter example to the Zariski's cancellation problem in positive characteristic, which I eventually proved yes. So this is, which eventually I proved that the ring A is not a polynomial ring where when this integer r is greater than 1. So seeing the importance of varieties defined by linear polynomials, we thought of a generalization of a Sartre-Russell theorem in higher dimension, and we considered K a field of any characteristic, and B to be the polynomial ring in M plus 3 variable, and H to be a linear polynomial in Y, and A be the quotient ring of B by H. And we investigated questions. Under what conditions can we say this ring A is isomorphic to a polynomial ring? And if so, if A is isomorphic to a polynomial ring, does that necessarily imply that H is a coordinate? So this is the epimorphism problem in higher dimension for this special form of H. And if further, can we say that if A is a polynomial ring, whether H is a coordinate along with xn up to xn? So this would generalize the theorem of Russell and Sartre of linear planes in higher dimensions, and we have obtained some affirmative answer under certain conditions on alpha and F with Purnashri Ghosh and Ananya Pal, and we obtained that when K is a field of characteristic 0 and F is any polynomial, all these questions have an affirmative answer. Further, over a field of arbitrary characteristic, and alpha is of this type. It's a product of polynomials A1, A2, Am, all of which have separable multiple roots A1, A2, Am, and F is any polynomial in Z and T. So we obtained affirmative answer to those questions. So the kind of theorem which we have obtained in higher dimension, let me illustrate it with an example with a theorem which I proved in 2014. So here I considered a polynomial G, which is a linear polynomial in Y in 4 variables, and I considered this ring A. Then I proved the equivalence of these 5 statements, that this ring A is isomorphic to a polynomial ring if and only A is isomorphic to a polynomial ring over the subring Kx, where X is the image of capital X in A. Further, these 2 conditions will hold if and only this small f is the projection along the line x is equal to 0, is a coordinate in KZT. And this is equivalent to say that G is a coordinate in the ring B. So B is this KXYZT, and it is equivalent to say that G is a coordinate along with X. So this problem that the condition whether this ring A is a polynomial ring or not can be easily determined by looking at small f, which is a polynomial in just 2 variables, and in 2 variables by the theorem of automorphism groups of polynomial ring in 2 variables, we can determine very easily whether f is a coordinate or not. So this theorem, see the equivalence of 1 and 4, proves a case of the epimorphism problem, and the equivalence of 1 and 5 generalizes the Russell-Sartre theorem for the linear planes. Further, this equivalence of 1 and 3 immediately proves that the Russell cubic and the Asanoma 3/4 are not polynomial rings. Let me end my talk by giving an example of a Bhattacharya and Datta. So this is here is a ring in 1 variable R, Ct, and A is a polynomial ring over R, xy, A equal to Rxyz. So if f is a linear polynomial in Z, so f is in some special type of linear polynomial in Z, which is inside A, and consider the subring B, which is generated by R, O, and F. So that is the subring C, T, F. So then Bhattacharya and Datta proved that this ring A is an A2 fibration over B. Further, this ring A, after adjoining one indeterminate, is isomorphic to a polynomial ring in 3 variables over B, and quotienting by F will give rise to a polynomial ring in 3 variables. So thus F is a linear hyperplane in C4, and then we know that the epimorphism problem would ask whether F is a coordinate, or we can ask more generally whether F is a coordinate along with T and F, or at least can F is a coordinate. So So this is an open problem for at least 30 years from now, and more than 30 years. And if the answer is no, then we have counter examples to all the three problems which I have mentioned, and all of them are very important, difficult problems hanging there for a long time. Finally, I would like to end my talk by paying tribute to my supervisor, Professor A.K. Datta, and Professor S.M. Bhatwatikar, my grand supervisor, and Professor Avinash Sathe, so all of them have been playing very crucial role in developing my research, and I have been greatly influenced by their working style and their research problems which they have been working on. So thanking you.
All
so
right.
These are some list of references, some recent preprints. Thank you.
I really do wish Professor Neena Gupta was here with us. She is doing something that she loves just as much. She was really sorry she couldn't be here. We do have Professor Amartya Datta here, and he can stay for questions over tea. So if you have any questions, you can address them to him. Professor Datta is right there. And if you don't have any questions right now, make sure you catch him over tea. I know we've all had a long evening. There is some nourishment outside, some food, and some more tea. Thank you. Thank you all for coming.